Welcome to this explainer. So today, we're tackling a genuinely fascinating legal concept that solves a very common, very human problem. Basically, how the law ensures nobody gets a free ride through what we call accidental obligations. Most of us probably think we only have legal obligations if we actively sign on the dotted line or, well, if we commit a crime. But there's this whole hidden world of legal relationships out there designed to step in when good deeds or just simple mistakes happen.
Think of our agenda today as your survival guide to the legal obligations you never even knew you had. We're going to cover what a quasi-contract actually is, the accidental manager, the mistaken payment, unjust enrichment versus mistakes, good faith versus bad faith, and some other everyday quasi-contracts.
All right, Section 1. What is a quasi-contract? The law's ghost contract. Let's dive right into how the law creates these invisible obligations.
Okay, so under Article 2142 of the Civil Code, a quasi-contract isn't an express contract at all. There is literally no meeting of the minds. Instead, the law imposes a fictional contract on the parties. Why? Well, to prevent one specific thing, unjust enrichment. The fundamental legal principle here is that no one should be unjustly enriched or benefited at the expense of another person. Basically, no free rides.
Now, there are three essential characteristics that trigger this legal fiction. Let's just punch right through them. First, the act must be lawful. This is what separates it from crimes, which we call delicts, and torts, known as quasi-delicts. Second, it has to be voluntary. This distinguishes it from obligations forced upon you by pure law, like paying your taxes. And third, it's unilateral, meaning it only involves the act of one person, which is completely distinct from ordinary bilateral contracts that actually require two people to agree.
Moving on to Section 2. The accidental manager, also known as negotiarum gestio. Picture this scenario for a second. Your neighbor disappears for months. Their farm is completely falling apart. The crops are dying. The animals desperately need feeding. So you step in. You take over the management of the farm just to save it. What happens next? Are you trespassing? Are you suddenly an employee? Well, this brings us to a concept known in Latin as negotiarum gestio, governed by Article 2144. It translates essentially to the voluntary management of someone else's property or affairs completely without their knowledge or consent. When you step in to save that neighbor's farm, you become what the law calls a jester.
But you don't just automatically become a jester. There are rules. 4 strict elements actually have to be met. First, the property truly has to be abandoned or neglected. Second, your assumption of this role must be totally voluntary and unilateral. Nobody ordered you to do it. Third, you absolutely must not be authorized by the owner, either expressly or impliedly. And fourth, you have to act in good faith strictly to protect the owner's interests, not just to make a quick profit for yourself. But hey, a quick word of warning. As a jester, you become liable for fortuitous events like acts of God if you take on risky operations, prioritize your own interests, or fail to return the property when asked. So it's not without its risks.
Okay, Section 3. The mistaken payment, or solutio in debiti. Be honest, have you ever accidentally sent a digital payment to the wrong phone number? Or maybe you overpaid a contractor because of a silly typo on an invoice. You basically sent money where it absolutely did not belong.
When that happens, you've just triggered our second ghost contract. It's called solutio in debiti, found under Article 2154. This pops up when a person pays or delivers something by mistake to another person who has absolutely zero legal right to demand it. Because of this legal fiction, the recipient is instantly legally obligated to return what they received.
Now, for this to actually hold up in court, 2 essential elements have to be there. First, there must be no binding relation. The payer literally has no duty to pay that specific recipient. Second, the payment must be made strictly through a mistake. It cannot be an act of liberality. Meaning, if you were just feeling super generous and decided to give a gift, well, you can't use solutio in debiti to demand it back later just because you changed your mind.
Which brings us to Section 4, unjust enrichment versus mistakes, distinguishing the legal remedies.
It's really crucial to understand how a specific mistake differs from the broader concept of unjust enrichment. So let's compare solutio in debiti with actione in rem verso. Solutio in debiti is a specific remedy for a mistaken payment. You absolutely have to prove that an error was made. On the flip side, actione in rem verso, which comes from Article 22, is based purely on one party being enriched at another's expense without a legal ground. Crucially, proving a mistake isn't required here at all. Actione in rem verso is essentially a subsidiary catch-all. You only use it if there's no other specific remedy provided by law.
Now, you might be thinking of that classic legal maxim, ignorantia legis non excusat, right? Ignorance of the law excuses no one. Generally speaking, if you make a mistake because you simply didn't know the law, well, that's your own fault. But quasi-contracts offer a pretty fascinating exception to this rule.
Enter Article 2155. If you make a payment due to a mistake in the construction or application of a genuinely doubtful or difficult question of law, it can actually qualify as solutio indebiti. This means if a legal provision is incredibly complex, may be subject to conflicting interpretations, or just totally unresolved by established courts at the time you paid, your legal mistake actually triggers the ghost contract and you can get your money back.
Section 5. Good faith versus bad faith and the consequences for the payee. Let's escalate the stakes a bit by looking at the innocent bystander, compared to someone actively trying to take advantage. The law handles this human behavior very differently based on intent. If the payee is in good faith, meaning they genuinely believe they had a right to the payment, they are treated pretty gently. They're only liable for the loss or impairment of the thing insofar as they actually benefited from it. But the payee in bad faith? Oh boy, this person knows they have no right to the money, and the law drops the hammer on them. They are liable for legal interest, any fruits the property produced, and absolutely any loss or impairment from any cause, even an unavoidable freak fortuitous event.
And finally, Section 6. Other everyday quasi-contracts. Legal fictions all around us.
To wrap up this explainer, let's look at a few more rapid-fire, real-world examples from the Civil Code that prove these fictions really are all around us. First, if a stranger provides necessary support to someone in need, they can demand reimbursement from the person legally obliged to provide that support unless it was just given out of pure pity. Second, if a third party pays for funeral expenses, the relatives of the deceased must reimburse them. Third, if you're unconscious in an accident and a stranger provides medical help, you're legally bound to pay for those services once you recover. And finally, if a third party pays off your debt without your knowledge, they can recover that money from you, but only to the extent that it actually benefited you.
The law is just constantly working in the background to ensure fairness, building these invisible obligations to keep the scales balanced. So, knowing what you know now about accidental managers, mistaken payments, and emergency good deeds, think back. Have you ever accidentally been part of a ghost contract without even realizing it? Keep an eye out, because your next good deed or your next typo just might create one. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.